Why doesn't Football Manager have any realistic competition? This question comes up every time a new version of Football Manager is about to be released. Usually you'll see people on message boards complain about one thing or other with the game. Then they'll bemoan the fact that there isn't any realistic competition. And the final conclusion is usually that the game just isn't worth buying anymore. But in the end, despite the complaints, the new version of Football Manager always seems to set new sales records. You ever wonder why that is? Well, it's not necessarily true that Sports Interactive has a monopoly. I mean, there are competitors, don't get me wrong. It's just that Sports Interactive has amassed something that nobody else can really compete with. That is the database. So let's go back in time and see how it turned out like this. As you probably know, Championship Manager was the original. This was the game that predated Football Manager. The first Championship Manager game was released for the Amiga way back in 1992. However, Championship Manager wasn't the only football management game released back then. Premier Manager also made its debut in 1992, also on the Amiga. The graphics look a little bit better to me. And this Amiga Action Review makes it clear that there were other competing games as well. The verdict was that it was best to own both Premier Manager and Championship Manager. And this is actually a pretty impressive score. So people tend to forget about series like this one. And actually, the cool thing about the Premier Manager series is that it saw console ports a long time before either Football Manager or the Championship Manager series ever saw them. Well, a port of Premier Manager 2 called just Premier Manager came out for the Sega Mega Drive back in 1995. The sequel to that on the Mega Drive was Premier Manager 97. And then the next year, Premier Manager 98 marked the start of the series on the PlayStation. Unfortunately though, the Premier Manager series eventually started to stall and most of the attention went back to Championship Manager. Now, when you go back and look at the history, the reason Championship Manager was so popular is kind of obvious. It's because of the massive database. But at the time, that wasn't that obvious. As you probably know, the first Championship Manager game only allowed you to coach in England. The first game with foreign coaching options was Championship Manager Italia, but this was a standalone title, which meant that you could only manage in Italy in that game. It's not really until Championship Manager 96-97 that you could manage either in Great Britain or Italy. And that was also the first game to reflect the famous Bosman ruling and the impact that it had on football contracts. Anyway, it's kind of crazy when you think about this, but actually Championship Manager didn't really have a graphical match engine until about 25 years ago. I mean, we're talking about, like the Windows XP era, Windows Vista era. This is after the game, of course, had switched from DOS to Windows. There was no graphical interface, at least for the match. That's really, really hard to believe in retrospect. So this in-game view comes from Championship Manager 01-02, for example. There's not much to it, right? You could slow it down to read the text properly, or you could zoom through it quickly and just react to things when they happen. Now, if you look at something like Premier Manager 97 on the Mega Drive, you'll notice that things were pretty similar. Premier Manager 98 on the PlayStation also didn't really have much of an in-game engine. You could make changes, of course, but only substitutions, no tactical changes. However, that game also had this video highlight option after the game was done.
Clear from the throw, the angle is difficult, and the goalkeeper, well, the ball just sticks as he comes to meet him.
Now this isn't perfect, but it's really good.
Lovely diagonal ball, far right on the edge of the area.
In fact, the announcer is a lot better than anything we have in Football Manager today.
And it comes through right in the middle. Brilliant stop.
And honestly, I think that the stadium graphics look better in this game than in FM24.
Plenty of space too, and plenty of creative ideas. This is another good move, and it's in!
Well, if you go back in time and you play the really old Championship Manager games, you will notice that the in-game experience is lacking. I'm talking about the match-to-match experience, not, like the spreadsheet stuff, all the real geeky stuff. But the truth is that the people playing this game were not really playing it for that match-to-match stuff. They weren't trying to play FIFA. They were playing it largely for the database and for that spreadsheet experience, for the realistic experience of trying to piece your team together. That required a lot of research, and that research only came about after years and years of effort. Now, Championship Manager 4 was probably the biggest release of the original series. That included the famous top-down match engine, which we know today as the 2D engine. This game was released on Windows in 2003, 5 years after Premier Manager 98, and it still only gave us a 2D engine. But if you focus only on the match engine, you will ignore the massive database and all the countries that you could manage in. A few months later came Championship Manager Season 03-04, which was the last time Sports Interactive used the Championship Manager name. This is a better game than CM4 because they fixed a ton of bugs in this one. And the database is absolutely massive. Anyway, as most of you guys know, that's where the split happened. And this split really demonstrates how valuable that Football Manager database really is. The story behind this is that Championship Manager was literally a bedroom programming project. Paul and Oliver Collier designed the first game as a hobby, taking about 6 years to do it. The first game was published by a company called Domark, which eventually changed its name. By the early 2000s, the company was known as Eidos Interactive, and Eidos wanted to exert more commercial control over the Championship Manager franchise. Or at least that's the story that Miles Jacobson has told over the years. I'm not sure what the Eidos side of this story actually is. Now, complicating things was the fact that Championship Manager 4 had a bunch of bugs at launch. Though the bugs were ironed out in the 03-04 release a couple months later, there was understandably some friction between the business side of the venture and the development side. And that's why the next Sports Interactive release was Football Manager 2005, not a Championship Manager game. Well, the deal apparently was that Eidos would get the Championship Manager name and that Sports Interactive would keep the people who, actually programmed the game on board, as well as the database. And as it turns out, that really was not a fair deal. Anyway, this reminds me of the deal that ended the NBA Jam series. So Midway had originally created the NBA Jam arcade games, which were hits worldwide. Acclaim was in charge of all of the home ports. Midway was upset that the home ports were making tons of money and decided to bring on an in-house programming team so that it could get more of the home console revenue. Acclaim then managed to get a deal with the NBA to give it the NBA Jam name. And so Acclaim came out with NBA Jam Extreme, which is a horrible game. Midway made NBA Hang Time, which was based on the original NBA Jam source code and which is remembered to this day as an all-time hit. So if any of you guys wind up in the software development business, remember that the source code is worth a lot more than the product name. However, in the Football Manager world, it's really the database more than anything else that has been the most important part. Well, that's exactly what we saw in 2004 after the split was made. Football Manager 2005 had a massive selection of playable leagues in a ton of countries, not too far off from where the series is now. The game was also released early. Championship Manager 5, meanwhile, was released 6 months later than scheduled, mostly because the source code had to be rebuilt from scratch. There were tons of bugs in the game, and worst of all, the player database really wasn't reliable. Even home releases on the Xbox and PlayStation 2 couldn't save this game. 20 years later, you could still find complaints from that time online, most of which focused on the bad database that Eidos had created. And, it was only a few years later that the Championship Manager series just completely ended. So what was once one of the biggest sports simulation series in the entire world wound up becoming little more than a footnote in the end. Why? It's because they didn't have the database. Messing around with the pregame editor in Football Manager can be a daunting task, as some of you already know. The user interface really isn't well designed, we all know that. However, the other daunting part is just how big and complex the database is. And this is actually Sports Interactive's biggest advantage. It's the one thing that no competitor has ever been able to match. The interesting thing here is that other games have offered features that the Championship Manager series and Football Manager series didn't have, some of them that the series still doesn't have. But that never really has been enough. You see, those extra features really did not match the depth of the gameplay that Sports Interactive always offered. For example, the old FIFA Manager series allowed you to make your own stadium, and we're talking about a series that ended over a decade ago. This also offered an impressive 3D view years before Football Manager got that far, but it didn't have the database, and so the series eventually faded away. Now, there are a few alternatives to Football Manager. I mean, there always have been. I mean, you can play games like We Are Football, sure. Somebody put together an update to FIFA Manager if you want to mess around with that. But all of these games have the same fundamental issue. They don't have Sports Interactive Scouting Network, and they simply cannot match its database. And as Sports Interactive has continued to get new licenses, the barriers to entry are only going to increase. And so, in a way, we're kind of stuck with Football Manager and Sports Interactive, for better or for worse. Anyway, I really don't think the Football Manager is an awful game. I know that this comes up every time we're going to get a new version, and people say, why do you buy the same awful game over and over again? Honestly, I'm really looking forward to FM26, and I do think that the game has been improving over time. Still, it would be nice if they had some of these quality of life changes, you know, like a stadium editor. I mean, FIFA had that like well over a decade ago. Why don't we have it today? The thing is, though, that I really doubt that we're going to see any meaningful competition to Football Manager anytime soon. I mean, think of it this way. EA Sports gave up on competing with Sports Interactive years ago. I just don't see any other company making a serious effort.